It's been a busy week so far, with some crazy text messages getting leaked, if you can call it a leak when a journalist is accidentally invited into a conversation. Plus, there have been developments in the Russia Ukraine negotiations. Today, I have organized the conversation to start with Signalgate, then move to Ukraine Russia, then discuss the Transatlantic Rift, then inside baseball of the work that I do, and then some time for the standard nonsense. Be sure to use the chapter function to skip around as you see fit. What are the chances that US adversaries were already monitoring the Signal group chat, but were waiting for a better time to use the information from it before the journalist leaked it? What are the chances that the leak was intentional to flood the zone? Well, this is a general problem in intelligence. If you have some sort of secret piece of information, you have to decide when you want to exploit it. And that is made all the more difficult if you are still getting new information from that source, and if you ever do exploit it, then that source may dry up. There's actually an interesting parallel in tennis. Once upon a time, Andre Agassi realized that Bjorn Borg had a tell in his serve, namely that Borg would stick out his tongue in the direction that he was planning to serve. The problem for Agassi, though, was figuring out how to optimally exploit that, because if he were to constantly guess correctly in the direction that Bjorn Borg was going to serve, Borg might realize that there was a tell and then start taking countermeasures to figure out what that is and shore it up. So Agassi had to, at some point, not go in the correct direction and choose wisely the specific points that he wanted to use that specific exploit. Well, you have the same problem in Intel, though here, in this specific case, I think the likelihood that there was a third party monitoring these sorts of texts more generally, not just this specific conversation, but other conversations as well, and choosing not to exploit it here, but rather wait for a better opportunity to exploit it, I think the likelihood of that is relatively low. The reason being is that the Signal app runs on an open source code, which means everyone in the exploit community can take a look at how this system operates and flag issues that come along with it. And that's actually a security feature, because when there are some issues that come along, those things get shored up relatively quickly. Now, that does not mean that there isn't some problem with the code. It is possible that some foreign government has realized that there are exploits that could be done that others inside of the open source community have not yet realized. But the likelihood of that sort of thing is relatively low. Here, the bigger problem is with the physical device. If someone is in on the conversation and leaves their physical device unattended, and someone with malicious intent sees it and then takes advantage of it, well, now they have access to all of that information. And there's still some chance that there's an issue with the physical device more broadly that leaves open the ability of a third party to have to decide when to exploit that specific thing. So it's not out of the question, I just don't think it's particularly likely here. Doesn't mean that it's not problematic for other reasons, just not for that specific reason in expectation. On the flooding the zone part, if you're the Trump administration, you want to flood the zone with things that you actually want to do. This is not serving as a distraction that is helpful for Trump trying to get his agenda passed. They would be better off flooding with things that Trump is actually trying to do with the agenda all at once, thereby preventing everyone from seeing what's going on with everything happening all at once. This is just a big political black eye that they would want to avoid. And it's also why I think that discussions about how somehow this might have been set up and this is an intentional thing that's going on in the Trump administration, because the Trump administration wants Europe to know that the Trump administration actually thinks that the Europeans are not spending enough on defense spending, and it's pathetic that they're not doing that sort of thing. That's kind of nuts, because you wouldn't want to go through this sort of political mess to do that sort of thing. Do you perceive that Signalgate will result in a decrease in intelligence sharing between the United States and the rest of the Five Eyes, NATO, or Ukraine? Obviously, I can't imagine that it would come to a complete halt, but how damaging is this to Western intelligence? Will the rest of the West just seek future assurances? Or will they simply not really be too bothered? Maybe on the margins, but in this particular case, the types of discussions that were being had were focused on what the United States was doing. I think this would be a much larger problem if they were discussing classified information that was coming from other actors, from other allies of the United States, in this sort of setting that could be vulnerable to someone looking at it that's not supposed to be looking at it. So I would describe this more as a problem for the US intelligence community. I think it's also worth noting that when third parties tend to share their intelligence with the United States, or vice versa for that matter, usually you're sharing the intelligence itself. You're not divulging the methods by which you gathered that intelligence. So, for example, you might have the United Kingdom tell the United States, we think that Russia is about to do this. And you would not have the United Kingdom say to the United States, we think that Russia is about to do this because we have this guy on the inside who has been talking to these three other individuals about doing that. Now, obviously, a leak of any kind might help the target of all this intelligence deduce how this was arrived at and then take countermeasures appropriately. So you don't want to just leak information, broadly speaking. But the reassurance to the Five Eyes, to NATO, or to Ukraine is that if you have a leak of the intelligence itself, you're probably not going to be leaking how the intelligence was arrived at, and that is the bigger thing to protect in the long run. Do you trust Putin to stick to a ceasefire, or will he break it quickly? Does Putin even want a lasting peace? Well, I guess we have triggered my rant for the day early today. A ceasefire will hold as long as war is worse for Russia, or equivalently, the ceasefire is better. It seems like there is a never-ending parade of media in the West that says something along the lines of, a ceasefire won't work because Putin will break it immediately. And maybe he will, but whether he does or not depends on how the West is structuring the ceasefire, and whether the West is giving Russia the incentive not to break it via the threats of what will happen if Russia does break it. It is generally true that this is how wars end. You look at the broad history of interstate conflict, the vast majority of those interstate conflicts end in some sort of negotiated settlement between the parties, whether that's a tacit negotiated settlement, like we have a ceasefire line and no formal treaty, or if it is a formalized treaty where there are signatures on a piece of paper. It is relatively rare for those sorts of things to be resolved militarily, where one side is militarily defeated, and thus they cannot continue the battle militarily at that point. And it's also basically never happened in the history of mankind, where at the end of the conflict, the leader that was involved at the start of the conflict changed their mind about being right or wrong about the substantive issues at stake. You end up in a situation where you fight for a while and then you negotiate based on the fact that you can't make further progress. There's agreement on both sides about what the relative likelihood of a war would look like if they continue to fight, but there are costs associated with doing that, and those costs incentivize negotiated settlements instead. So if the West wants a lasting peace here, they have to create the incentive structure that ensures that Russia does not want to break the ceasefire, which means making sure that Ukraine has a very strong front line, and that if Russia tries to break that front line, Russia is going to suffer immense casualties doing so, and will be relatively unlikely to succeed, which means that you need to have lots of funding for Ukraine, you need to have continued military shipments to Ukraine, and you need those front lines to be well built. That is the only way that this is going to work. If it is done, you can have a lasting peace. Will Putin be happy about this? No, he will still prefer a world where he has greater control over Ukraine, but that's just not how the world works either. If Russia is unable to do that militarily, then Putin is going to have to just stick with what he can get. But again, it is up to the West to make sure that Russia can't get more by breaking the ceasefire. That's how you get a lasting ceasefire to work. It has been said by both Russian officials and third-party commentators that Russia must receive the rest of the 4 claimed Oblasts in order to sign an actual legal peace treaty, as these regions have joined Russia in their entirety since the referendum, and the Russian constitution has no apparatus for regions leaving the Federation. Is this an actual minimum requirement you expect Russia to die by in negotiating? Or is this just posturing and a legal peace deal, from the Russian perspective, could be worked out without Ukraine ceding cities such as Kramatorsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia? In short, no. Russia will accept a lot less. And if you need to verify that, just think to yourself for a moment, how is the Kremlin going to capture Kherson? Russia has been on an offensive for more than a year now, and think about how costly that has been to Russia, and while yes, Russia has made steady gains, it hasn't been enormous. And these have been occurring in relatively favorable areas to Russia. In contrast, Kherson City, the capital of Kherson Oblast, sits behind the Dnipro River. For Russia to capture it, Russia will have to engage in some sort of marine landing operation to get across the river, establish a beachhead, and then continue fighting in a relatively large city. Russia has shown no capacity recently to be able to do that, and it's hard to imagine how that is going to improve over time when, due to attrition rates, Russia is constantly having to recruit more individuals, but at the same time, every individual that you recruit makes it more difficult to recruit the next person. It's going to be more expensive to do that, it's going to be harder to find those individuals. A Kherson landing operation would be an enormous task, and this is in a location where in November 2022, Ukraine expelled Russia from previously, and now Kherson is much better defended today than it was at the start of the war in February of 2022. So with all of that as preface, it is puzzling why there are still conversations that go on in Western media about these being serious demands from Russia, something that Russia is seriously thinking that is plausible to ask for in a negotiation, rather than just posturing, the straight-up posturing that it is. Now, the question as asked makes an important distinction here about whether this is going to be some sort of legally codified peace treaty, something that is formalized and has signatures on it and ends the war formally speaking. And this is suggesting, both from the Ukrainian constitutional perspective and the Russian constitutional perspective, that that is not going to be the case, that we're going to have a tacit peace agreement instead, where there is a ceasefire and an end to the hostilities on an informal level, even if it's not a formal level. But in practice, that's not a distinction that matters too much. Think about this to yourself. How much in your everyday life does it matter that the Korean War is still technically ongoing? And it's just a ceasefire and an armistice that has lasted now, the better part of a century. It doesn't. It doesn't matter to our everyday lives. It doesn't matter to the everyday lives of people in Korea either. So, in conclusion here, treat this as posturing, and recognize that, yes, maybe this will affect the words that are written down on the piece of paper that formally or informally ends the war. But that's the type of distinction that a lawyer might be interested in, but anyone who is more involved in the practical matters of the situation are not going to sweat. Let's suppose for a minute two things. One, Ukraine believes that a ceasefire will result in the West losing interest and support drying up. Thus, they will be left vulnerable to some future Russian invasion, which will then have a much greater possibility of succeeding. 2. Russia believes that a ceasefire will result in Ukraine building entrenchments and strengthening its position, making a future attack much less likely to succeed. If both of these are true, the two sides have a disagreement about changes in relative power, and both are incentivized to keep the war active. However, as the uncertainty is purely based on a hypothetical future where a ceasefire happens, no amount of combat will resolve the uncertainty. Imagine such a scenario. How can the bargaining friction get resolved to allow a negotiated settlement? Whether or not there is a solution in the hypothetical situation that I have described, are there other situations where the bargaining friction really is, or at least seems to be, even to experts, intractable? It's a long question, so I will try to keep this answer a bit shorter. Yeah, it is much, much harder to resolve this sort of situation than it is to resolve a more normal sort of uncertainty over what the outcome of war would be that depends on what is actually taking place on the battlefield from the start of the war to the end of the war, rather than some sort of hypothetical future that we can't quite get to yet. Actually, this is a research project that I have been working on since the start of the war, and indeed inspired by the war. Take two relatively similar models, differing on just one dimension. Start with a canonical model of uncertainty over war, where you fight battles over many different periods, and there may be disagreement over the likelihood of winning each of those given battles that is tied together across all of those different battles. So if you fight in the first period, you learn something about who's relatively likely to win or lose in not only this period, but the next period, and the last period. And so in those sorts of standard canonical models, you end up getting these nice convergence properties where over time, through the battlefield results as well as the negotiating at the table, where someone who is relatively likely to win and has the private information that they are relatively likely to win is more obstinate and rejects more offers. Through that process of both fighting and bargaining, you learn about the relative underlying probability of winning the war. And so you don't have a war fought to completion all of the time. You might fight battles for some number of periods and then get a settlement. Now, compare that to a second model, which is identical to the first model in every single way, except in the second model, there is common knowledge about what's going to happen in the first few rounds of the war. The only thing that there is disagreement over is what will happen in that last period. Well, what I can show is that if a war starts in this second model, then with positive probability, the war will continue until there is a complete military end to the conflict, which is in contrast to that other type of model. That original canonical model of uncertainty over war, there are circumstances where the expectation from everyone who is engaging in the game and watching as an outside observer will say, okay, there is going to be some number of battles being fought, but there is a fixed endpoint for the war where they're not going to go past that because enough will have been learned by that point to resolve the negotiations. So this question is hitting on a very important point, which is that late-stage uncertainty is much more difficult to resolve than a source of uncertainty that is governing the likelihood of victory in all battles over the course of a war. Now, the one caveat that I need to add here is that this problem is not inherently intractable. In other words, there is no guarantee that the war will be fought, even with late-stage uncertainty, all the way until the end of the war, at which point that uncertainty is revealed or rendered irrelevant by a military defeat. The reason is complicated. I will try my best here, but I apologize in advance. Think about your country. There are lots of different possible worlds that you could be in right now as a country, and you have private information about which of those worlds that you are in. Okay? It might be the case that you're in a really bad situation in the long run, or it might be the case that you're in a really good situation in the long run. And you have private information about which is true. The other side does not know, but might speculate that there's relative different probabilities that you're in each of those cases. But you have private information about which one you're specifically in. All right. If you're the type of country that is in the best possible situation in the realm of different possibilities, then you are going to hold out throughout all of the negotiations. Meanwhile, what will happen through the earlier rounds of negotiations before you reach the endpoint where the true information is revealed, the opponent is going to slowly try to pick off some of those types by offering progressively larger amounts, which, despite the temptation to bluff, are still going to be enough. But the key thing here is that those weaker types, the ones that are not as advantaged in the long run, at no point do they completely filter themselves out so that only the strongest type remains. And the reason is that over time, when you're fighting those battles, there's no difference between the weaker types and the stronger types prevailing in the short run. It's only about what happens in the long run. And until you reach the point where the long run starts to matter, where there actually is a difference in those types, there is no costly signal that is being made, or differentially costly signal that is being made between the weaker and stronger types that can actually drive a credible separation between the two and eliminate the desire to bluff. So it is possible for there to be a settlement. But if we make an apples-to-apples comparison of a model where there is consistent uncertainty throughout the entire interaction, and a second model where we have uncertainty just at the end of the game, that latter model is going to feature a lot more war and a lot less settlement than that former model. Can you elaborate on the Black Sea deal? It seemed that Ukraine was dominating the Russian Navy with sea drones. To me, it just looks like a win for Russia. Well, I think with all of this talk and all of the ceasefire negotiations, we need to wait a minute and see what actually is going to happen there. But yes, at least as it stands, the benefit is disproportionately Russia's, and it's for the reason that was described in the question, that Ukraine has done fairly well for itself with drones on the Black Sea, attacking Russian naval assets in the eastern half of the Black Sea and forcing them to go further and further back, and thereby allowing grain trade to happen along the western coast of the Black Sea. As for why this is happening, well, it's a natural consequence of the conditional armament plan that we have seen many, many different times before on the main channel. In this conditional armament plan, Ukraine is going to see its aid cut if Ukraine refuses to participate, and Russia is going to see Ukraine get massively ramped up aid if Russia refuses to participate. And it is possible under those circumstances, and indeed very plausible, that a large range of negotiated settlements becomes possible under those circumstances. And remember that the Trump administration does not seem to care very much about which of those feasible settlements is the one that's actually arrived at. And I think what we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks is that the Kremlin has done a very good job of trying to set the agenda on exactly which of these things is going to happen. Clearly, this is good for Russia and not so great for Ukraine. But at the same time, this is not what the Trump administration has in mind with what a ceasefire is going to look like. The White House is not interested in small scale ceasefires. The White House wants the war to end fully, and stopping the war on just the Black Sea or some sort of infrastructure agreement, that doesn't end the war. So it will be interesting to see over the next few weeks how the Trump administration deals with this. If they view Russia as only being interested in doing small things that disproportionately benefit Russia, does that ultimately frustrate the Trump administration and force the Trump administration to start playing that card of increasing aid to Ukraine? If it doesn't, then the onus is on Ukraine to find other areas where small scale ceasefires would disproportionately benefit Ukraine, and lobby the United States that Ukraine is fully supportive of this, and this as ceasefires, and force Russia's hand to break those so that Ukraine is looking like the one that is more interested in the peace. Now, there's no guarantee that this will in fact increase aid to Ukraine from the United States, but it certainly makes the political circumstances more favorable for that to happen. And if you're Ukraine, to use a little bit of gamer parlance here, you need to play to your outs. Sometimes those outs don't actually work out for you, but if they might, and there's some chance that it will work, and you have the ability to get yourself into the position where you could possibly be benefiting from those outs, then you need to be playing to those outs. Both sides in the Ukraine conflict have an incentive to make the other side look like they are not following the current rules or ceasefire agreements. How can you lower the chance of having a false flag attack blamed on you, or is it not worth the sacrifice to make that happen? Well, this is just a natural consequence of the incentive structure that the ceasefire agreement, as the United States has in mind, is going to create. And there just isn't a good answer to that. If aid is being conditioned on who is more willing to participate in a ceasefire, then the task for each party is to make the other side be the one that seems like they're more interested in breaking it, just as we talked about in the previous question. And perhaps the best way to do that is to stage a false flag attack. Now, in terms of trying to make that sort of thing succeed, at least in the short run, Russia is the one that has the incentive to break the ceasefire. Remember that Russia currently has the initiative along the Eastern Front, and especially in Kursk, and that Ukraine would benefit by having a timeout in fighting to improve its defensive lines. So if there ever is some type of an attack, it is imperative that the US intelligence community takes a moment, tries to figure out who has the incentive to do it, and does not just look at what exactly happened and who was targeted to try to decide who is the one that was actually responsible for it. Oftentimes, false flag attacks are not very good at fooling other countries about what has happened. Other countries can use their intelligence organizations to try to deduce what actually went on and figure out who was responsible and culpable for it, and then can assign the blame appropriately. Where false flag attacks are more effective is trying to create a rally round the flag effect. So I am the leader of my own country, I want to start a war against another country, I want my population to support me in that effort. The way that I go about doing it is by staging a false flag attack on my own country so that everyone rallies to me. The third-party observers, as well as the other country, know full well that I was the one that was responsible for it, but my domestic messaging to everyone inside of my country is something along the lines of, you can't trust those foreign intelligence organizations, they're trying to fool you, you have to believe me and trust me, I am your dear leader, I am going to help you, we need to work together to try to destroy this second country that was responsible, quote-unquote, for the false flag attack. But to sum up here, this is something that the United States and Europe and others are just going to have to deal with because that is the incentive structure that is created. And it can be dealt with proper intelligence, but there is no silver bullet to this sort of problem, and it's just something that the West is going to have to learn to live with. There are talks on putting some other European countries under the nuclear umbrella of the United Kingdom and France. I was wondering what made the United States offer nuclear protection to some countries in Europe back in the day, and for what interest. Therefore, what would push France and the United Kingdom to do it as well if the United States removes its missiles? Well, it's a couple of things: nuclear externalities and loss of agenda-setting control. If you have another country that has nuclear weapons, then that is another risk to some sort of catastrophic nuclear accident. If you don't like that, then it might help you to do some sort of nuclear sharing. It also means that you lose agenda-setting control. If you have control over the nuclear weapons, then you get to dictate exactly how those things are going to be used. If another country were to build the nuclear weapons instead, and incur all of those costs associated with it, they get the full choice. But by virtue of the fact that those nuclear weapons are costly, you might be able to structure some sort of agreement where the would-be nuclear proliferator gets some of the benefits associated with having a nuclear weapon, but that the patron state, the United States here, retains some control over what's going on there so that the full benefit is not realized in a way that is beneficial ultimately to the United States. So the question that's relevant now is, do the United Kingdom and France care about agenda-setting power? And also, do they care about nuclear externalities? If so, then the onus is on them to perhaps talk more to a country like Poland and convince Poland that it is not in Polish interests to develop nuclear weapons. But of course, that's not just going to be a conversation. There's going to have to be some sort of tangible concessions made to Poland or other countries to convince them not to do that. How would a more independent Europe work to build its own intelligence to be more independent from the United States? As you said in a previous video, it's something that is very easy to switch off. Well, it's the same thing that Trump has been hammering Europe about with everything else. It's about money. That this is costly to do, and so if you want to have better intelligence organizations, the way that you need to do that is by spending more to build greater intelligence organizations. The funny thing about intelligence is that intelligence itself is secret. How to do it is not so much of a secret. You just have to pay to do it, and it can be expensive. Of course, there are some things on the intelligence technological frontier where you have to be doing things that are not public information and not obvious how to do. But this isn't a problem for Europe because Europe is on the technological frontier in a whole bunch of different industries. So it's something that Europe has the capacity to do, they just have to spend the money on it. Should Europe compete more in the space race and build bases on the moon? Can you imagine the aneurysms that would go on in the White House if instead of Europe spending more money on arms, Europe was spending more money on space? Which war, in international relations academia especially, do you think is overstudied? Which is understudied? More broadly, is there a pattern to which wars are analyzed under bargaining theory? There is a clear answer to what is overstudied. It is World War I, and it is not even close. You can fill multiple bookshelves in a very long library with books that have been written about World War I. And I hadn't thought about this until this question was asked, but there is pretty good diversity in the case studies that crisis bargaining researchers work on. I think the reason for that is the onus is no longer on us to come up with some sort of grand theory for how the world works. We have our baseline level of understanding about what is happening in conflict, and that any sort of explanation for war needs to be able to give some sort of reason why the countries chose to fight instead of have a negotiated settlement that would save on the costs of war. So as a result of that, we're not really feeling like there's a chip on our shoulder to be able to explain a major conflict like World War I. Whereas historically speaking, if you had a new researcher come out with a new theory of war, then it would be imperative from their perspective to be able to explain World War I with it. Otherwise, their theory is worthless or something like that. But given that someone who studies what I study is not bound by that constraint, we can spend a lot more time working on the nuances of bargaining frictions, which leads us to explore a lot more obscure wars than you would get from a normal treatise on some brand new international relations theory. In game theory, we assume the participants to be rational actors, with the group chat leak giving us a peek into the mindsets of key figures of the Trump administration. How would you assess that assumption? Well, let's take a step back for a second. In game theory, rationality is defined in just this way. This is it. Complete intransitive preferences. And all that means is that if I give you a list of possible outcomes, can you return a list that gives me at the top of the list your most preferred outcome, and at the bottom of your list your least preferred outcome, and everything in between going in order of your preference, with ties being allowed? If you can do that, then you are a rational actor in the way that we define rationality in game theory. Well, despite that, it is not that hard to find examples of people who look at the Trump administration and say, those people are crazy, they're irrational. Or, go back a few months before that, same thing was being said about the Kremlin and Putin. I do not think that either of them fail that rationality definition above. Instead, what's going on here is that you have a group in the West that says, I don't have the preferences the Trump administration has. I don't have the preferences that Vladimir Putin has. They are crazy for having those preferences, and therefore we can't model their behavior. No, we can model behavior if you have rational preferences, if you have a complete and transitive preference ordering. If you can give me a list of outcomes and then tell me at the top of the list what your favorite outcome is, and put at the bottom of your list the worst outcome and put everything else in between. That's rationality. For the Trump administration, it is to have Europe be more responsible for European security affairs, even if that comes at a relatively high cost. Lots of people in the United States do not share that preference, but that does not mean that Trump is irrational. He just has that preference. It is what it is. Same thing with Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin wants to have lots of Ukrainian territory. He's willing to pay a very high cost to do that. Lots of people in the West do not share that preference. But that just means that Vladimir Putin has a different set of preferences from the West. That does not mean that Vladimir Putin is irrational. Getting back to the specific question at hand, what we've seen from Signalgate is exactly that. We've seen first-hand accounts and messages in the highest levels of the administration, up to but not including the president, that they don't care. They want Europe to do more, and that's just how they feel about things. And again, we can have a strong policy disagreement about whether that is a good idea or not, but that does not impact whether they are rational or not. Rationality is just a complete and transitive preference ordering. Now, there's a separate question here about whether the Trump administration is astrategic. In other words, you can be a rational actor. You can have complete and transitive preferences, but act astrategically. In other words, you're not thinking through the incentives, you're not taking the actions that actually get you to the outcomes that you desire. I don't think Signalgate tells us much on that dimension, but zooming out a bit further, there's nothing that says that you have to have only strategic actors in a model. We've seen that before recently on the main channel with that video about madman theory. You can have astrategic actors in a model. When you program strategic actors in a model, you're telling them that they are going to do the things that maximize their welfare, and they're going to try to take the actions that get them to the outcomes that they most desire. It's perfectly fine to have an astrategic actor in a model as well. You just have to program them to do other things that are not trying to maximize those sorts of things. Dutch public news recently reported on pacifists. They claim that increases in armament spending increase the likelihood of war. Given the increased cost of war for aggressors, this seems unlikely to me. Is there scientific evidence proving or disproving this relation? Well, there is evidence that arms races correlate with war, but the key thing is that the relationship is not causal. That's actually something that really bad political science from the 1970s and 1980s got confused about, and it's something that I use as an example in my Introduction to International Relations class in the real world, in real life, as a reason that you have to be careful about statistical correlations and that correlation is not causation. Arms races and war are correlated because there is something that causes both of them at the same time, namely bargaining frictions. We all know that war is inefficient because people die, but arms races are inefficient too because you have to spend all of the money to build those arms. So you wouldn't want to build arms if you could negotiate a resolution to the problem instead, and what prevents you from negotiating a resolution to the underlying problem is the bargaining friction. So if you have a bargaining friction, you get arms races, and those arms races, sometimes they effectively signal preferences, and so you don't get war, but sometimes they don't effectively signal preferences, and you do get war. Arms races correlate with war, but it's the bargaining friction that's causing both of them to happen at the same time. Arms races and war are correlated because something causes both of them at the same time, namely bargaining frictions. I don't need to tell you, as a viewer of a channel called Lines on Maps Extra, that war is inefficient because people die. But arms races are inefficient too. If you're building arms, that's going to cost money, and you would like to spend that money on something else that's going to be a little bit more productive. As a result, if there were no bargaining frictions, you would not get arms races. Likewise, if there were no bargaining frictions, you would not get war. Sometimes, through an arms race, you can actually effectively signal your preferences, how resolved you are on the issues at stake, and the arms races might actually then help reduce the prevalence of war. But conditional on observing an arms race, you know that there's some sort of bargaining friction out there, and if you know that there's some sort of bargaining friction out there, that's going to update your belief on the likelihood of war. That's why those two things correlate. Now, the message that you might want to send to the individuals that are referenced in the question is that if bargaining frictions are what cause war, armaments are not going to have a direct impact on that. Instead, what armaments do is change where the center of agreement is. Remember that the bargaining range, the set of settlements that are mutually preferable to war, that is constructed around what the expected outcome of war is. So if tomorrow you stop building weapons, That may not change the probability of a war, but I can tell you for sure what that is going to do is that any peaceful settlement that is resolved short of a war is going to start looking less attractive for you. And in the event that a war does happen, that war is going to look less attractive for you. At this point, who do you think the Democrats and Republicans will run in the 2028 election? Well, this is not my expertise, but I'll answer this even though you should not take this as being worth much of anything. The Republicans are probably going to have Vance as their candidate. It should probably be Rubio if they want to win. The Democrats are probably going to have Newsom as their candidate. It should be Shapiro if they want to win. 2 notes on that. 1, J.D. Vance is one of the most unpopular politicians in the United States, but because he is the vice president, he is the path of least resistance in terms of who's going to be the next nominee, which places him in a relatively privileged position there. And for the Democrats, I say Shapiro is the better candidate if the Democrats want to win, despite the fact that he is my nemesis. Oh, and just so we're clear, that's a reference to the fact that, like myself, Josh Shapiro has a degree from the University of Rochester in political science. How does the Signalgate scandal compare to other scandals, such as the Obama tan suit incident? Well, to be blunt, we as a country have never recovered from this, just like we as a country have never recovered from this. And what are the odds that we have 2 separate tennis references in one episode? Sorry for the silly question, but what's the difference between a historian and a political scientist? Both study the politics of the past to say something about the present or the future. Well, historians are not always studying politics, so there is a difference there, but more broadly speaking, historians are in the humanities. They're a humanities department, not a social sciences department, and broadly speaking, they are reporting on what has happened. So they are going to the archives and trying to understand what actually went on in the time period that they are studying. This is more of a just the facts ma'am style of research, where they need to figure out what happened, when it happened, where it happened, that sort of thing. Political scientists, in contrast, we're in the social sciences, we're a social sciences department, and that means we end up spending most of our time doing math. It turns out that undergrads hate doing math, so if you've only taken political science classes as an undergrad, it's possible that you never encountered any math that you had to do, because we want to have enrollments, and if you want to have enrollments, then probably having math in your classes is not a good idea. But in terms of what graduate students do and what professors are doing, the vast majority of us, especially the ones of us who are still getting jobs in the current environment, which is much more competitive than it was, say, 20 years ago, we are doing math. We are doing math when we get up in the morning, we are doing math when we go to bed at night. And the reason that we are doing all of that math is that, as a social sciences discipline, we are interested in making generalized inferences. That means, for quantitative researchers, gathering data and running regressions. Or for someone more like myself, building models and solving those models using mathematical tools. Do politicians ask academics like yourself to advise them? Do they follow their advice? Well, politicians perhaps not so much, but if you expand that out to governments more broadly, yes, it is very common for people like me to spend time in government, even though I myself never have. Oftentimes what this looks like is a 1-year postdoc or a 1-year research leave, where a newly minted PhD or a professor will go situate themselves inside of the State Department or the Department of Defense or something like that and work on a particular problem for a year. There are also plenty of opportunities inside of international organizations like the United Nations or the IMF. As for what actually goes on while we are there, do policymakers listen to us? Yes. Do they follow us? Well, that's a harder question, and it depends. For example, a policymaker might approach me and say, hey, there's this conflict, how do we go about resolving it? And I might say to them, the best way to do it is A, B, and C. Do those 3 things, we'll be good. Policymaker might look at that and say to themselves, you know what? A and B, those sound great, but my constituents are never going to go with C, so we'll just do the first 2. Are they listening to me? Yes. Are they following what I'm saying? I guess that depends on your interpretation. How did you get into your line of work? Well, if we're talking about my real job, there's no other way around it. You have to get a PhD, although given the current situation, that's probably not necessarily a safe bet in terms of your job prospects later on. As for YouTube, my best advice would be don't, and that's an even firmer don't than don't get a PhD. But if I had to provide some sort of constructive advice, I suppose it would be to keep publishing a lot, because you're not going to have a successful channel if you're never publishing things. Still, getting successful on YouTube is a crapshoot, and for me myself, I've been publishing things on this channel in various degrees that are somewhat roughly equivalent to what I'm doing now all the way back to 2009, and it was extremely unsuccessful in terms of it being a sustainable business model up until 2022. So that's 13 years of putting in a lot of effort and not getting a lot of reward from it. And indeed, the only reason it was sustainable is because of my real job. That publishing, while not financially worthwhile, was able to increase my reputation academically and professionally, which had fringe benefits in what I was doing in that career. More specifically about how I got into this, I just published a video one day that had 2 million views, and it took me about 3 or 4 months to really understand why that was successful and to be able to replicate a strong degree of success over the long run. But eventually I did, and here we are today. And that ties into the next question. Do you assign your students to watch your videos? No, not the ones that you guys tend to watch and not the ones that I spend most of my time trying to publish now. However, if you go deep into my main channel, you can check the playlist there, and you will find all of the classes that I have taught over the last 10 years or so on that channel. Those are the videos that I assign to my students as a secondary source of lecture materials, especially if they have missed class or something like that. And you will find out very quickly that in those lectures, there's a lot more math than what you guys see on the main channel currently. Do you intend to make a video on the events that led to the Ukraine war in the last 20-ish years at any point? 2004, Georgia, the EU negotiations, 2014, etc.? No. I did it once for the Crimean annexation, and it did a decent number of views, but it's not the type of thing that has a broad enough interest for me to be continuing to work on. What career would you choose if you had to change your profession? Lines on baked goods? Actually, if I had to do something completely different, I might try being a traffic engineer, which sounds like it's very strange, but I find it to be very interesting, and there are strategic dimensions that you may not be aware of. In fact, let's go back to the archives. Look at this video. This one simple trick reduces travel times. 2,400 views 3 years ago. I get about 2,400 views in the first 4 minutes of publishing a new video now. Anyway, the subject of this is, imagine you have 100 people that are traveling from the suburbs in the bottom left corner to the downtown in the top right, and there are a couple of different paths that they can take. Starting at the bottom, there is a road that will take 15 minutes no matter how many people are on it. Think about that as some sort of high-density road like a freeway with just a ton of lanes. So it doesn't matter how many people are on that road, it'll only take 15 minutes. The other option is to go a little bit more north, and that's a smaller road. Think about that as a local road that is much more sensitive to the number of people traveling on it, so that travel times on there depend on the number of people choosing to drive on it, and it's going to be n divided by 10 minutes. Again, 100 people traveling here in total. Regardless of which road you take initially, there is a 2-minute road that allows you to connect between the other two options, which again is a high-density 15-minute route, or a more sensitive n divided by 10-minute route. If you spend a moment working on this, you will quickly realize that each individual driver, regardless of what the other drivers are doing, is better off taking the n divided by 10-minute route initially, then going down south along the 2-minute route briefly, and then taking the other n divided by 10-minute route into downtown. That results in a total travel time of 22 minutes. And yet, weirdly, if you destroy that connecting road, just bomb it or something like that, then what ends up happening instead is you have 50 drivers going the northerly route and 50 drivers going the southerly route, and the total travel time under that circumstance is 20 minutes. The interesting thing there, and you may have picked up on this, is that you can improve commute times by destroying some infrastructure. This, as it turns out, is a bizarre application of a prisoner's dilemma, and if you spend enough time on a Lines on Maps channel, you of course know that there are all sorts of applications of the prisoner's dilemma in social science phenomena, including in war. So, I suppose in that regard, it is not that bizarre that I might be interested in traffic engineering. I understand that most of your videos are essentially a 101 level of understanding, but even that superficial level of knowledge helps me, as someone from a very different field of study, physics, to see things in a different light. Is there a field of study that you have very little knowledge of, but would like to understand at a 101 level? One that you understand a little bit, but would like to know a bit more about? A field which, in an alternative reality where you could not study international relations, game theory, or something else directly adjacent to your actual area of study, you would believe be an interesting alternative career for you? Well, aside from the traffic engineering thing from a moment ago, I'm going to go with immunology here. And interestingly enough, that probably would have happened had the invasion of Ukraine not happened in 2022. And you know what? Maybe eventually it will happen, but it's not on the agenda anytime soon. The reason that I find immunology interesting is that there is a deep connection to what I study with international relations. Immunology is a question about war, it's just on a microscopic scale instead of the macroscopic scale that we look at on this channel. But wars at any level are inefficient, and therefore raise questions about why they happen. I have a friend who works in an immunology department, and we had some ideas about where we might go with this, but again, due to the war, I just haven't had the time to do it. Maybe eventually I will, who knows. What is the font you use? Cambria, yeah. Favorite pizza? I will go with barbecue chicken, with the caveat that the year that I did my postdoc, about half of the days lunch was catered, and it was almost always pizza. And even though that was more than 9 years ago now, I still just don't want to eat any pizza. What do you do on those days when it seems that all you do is in vain? Well, you can go for a long walk in nature, that's a good idea. But aside from that, as I've talked about before, recently I've been playing a lot of Balatro. I've just finished my first 2 gold stakes, so I'm almost done. I'm pretty excited for that. And I have purchased Slay the Spire, so that'll probably be the next thing that I do. And that's probably something that I should go do now. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.